Okay, so today we are going to just talk about the background for Dubliners, the novel. Okay, so Dubliners is a collection of 14 stories. They cover various walks of life, beginning with childhood, with the sisters, an encounter, and Araby, which we already covered in the last unit. It then moves on to a collection of stories having to do with adolescence. Eveline, who is an 18-year-old girl, very much in between childhood and adolescence, just on the cusp of adulthood. Two Gallants and After the Race feature young men in their 20s who are young but old enough to be considered adults, but not really yet burdened with the responsibilities of adulthood like marriage and children. And then The Boarding House, which features an older woman, but a woman who has a young daughter named Polly. So it is also about a woman who is outside of marriage. She is a divorced woman, a woman whose marriage has ended, but she is running her own boarding house and taking care of her young daughter, who's just beginning her life as a young woman. Then it moves into the mature life. So this is both characters who are inside and outside the institution of marriage. A Little Cloud and Counterparts feature married individuals. They are stuck in their marriage, unhappy marriages. Clay and A Painful Case feature Clay, the old spinster, and A Painful Case, the older bachelor, so older characters who have never married. And then the book ends with a collection of stories that expand to the public realm. Grace is a story that deals with the paralysis inside the Irish Catholic religion. Ivy Day in the Committee Room features a story about the politics of Ireland, which Joyce saw as being a cycle of violence and bloodshed with no real resolution. And A Mother, which features the world of Irish writing and art and music, so the world of the arts. Dubliners originally was supposed to end with this public life collection, but the publishers thought that it ended on too bitter a note, too biting in satire. And so he softened it with the added on short story or novella, because it's quite a bit longer than the others, called The Dead, which brings many of the types of characters that you've seen all throughout the stories into one place, a Christmas party during the Feast of the Epiphany. It is still quite a serious story, but it does end in a softer, less biting, less harsh of a way than the public life chapters end. So Joyce is a hugely popular figure in Irish culture. He's considered to be one of their great national treasures as a writer, which is odd because Joyce, during his life, was extremely critical of Ireland and the Irish people. He believed that Ireland was a little bit behind in terms of artistic innovation, that the Irish people were stuck in superstition, stuck in their religion, that they were separate from a more advanced, more lively rest of Europe. And so he felt really in particular that in order to examine the state of paralysis, being stuck in circumstances, sometimes beyond your control, that to be a Dubliner was the perfect example of that. There's something about being a Dubliner that's different than being a Londoner or a Parisian. The Irish in particular are plagued with routine that seems to suck away at true living for passion, living for purpose, being self-actualized, that the problem of the comfortable routine is something that the Irish specifically seem to understand. So this is his message about the purpose of the novel Dubliners. My intention was to write a chapter of the moral history of my country, and I chose Dublin for the scene because that city seemed to me the center of paralysis. I have tried to present it to the indifferent public under 4 of its aspects: childhood, adolescence, maturity, and public life. The stories are arranged in this order. I have written it, for the most part, in a style of scrupulous meanness, and with the conviction that he is a very bold man who dares to alter in the presentment, still more to deform, whatever he has seen and heard. So Joyce's meanness, his scrupulous meanness, is the key tone of this novel. Each short story presents characters who are trapped in circumstances, and each story is a call to break free, to go beyond the routine, and to find a meaningful existence elsewhere. Joyce is a bit of a paradox in that he left Ireland, abandoned his native land, culture, and religion, and spent most of his career as a writer writing on the continent of Europe, particularly in Paris. But all of his fiction is set in Ireland, and he uses Ireland as a tiny version of people everywhere, a microcosm for all cultures, all places. So you don't have to be Irish to see yourself in some of these stories or people that you know. So very quickly, what is a short story? You would think we would know by now, since we just finished a unit of short stories. There is no specific length, number of pages that makes a short story. It could be a few paragraphs, or it could be 70 to 80 pages. There are a few key characteristics, though. A short story does have to be brief in action. It has to be compressed so that it centers around one central theme, and there are a limited number of characters. This is not a Victorian novel where you're going to have huge amounts of pages and space for an author to set the scene, lots and lots of characters that overlap. This has to all take place in the space of a couple of pages. So there's also going to be an immediacy to the action. You're going to meet the characters and images that set the scene and the place and the time for the story. There's a consistency, a unification of time and place, all within the arc of the story, and an economy. The language must be concise. Again, only because a short story has to be brief in nature. There's something connected deeply to Irish culture in the act of storytelling, specifically short stories. Stories are told and retold for entertainment purposes. That's deeply embedded in Irish culture. And James Joyce knew that. And perhaps that's one reason why he chose to give us a series of short stories. When these short stories are interlocked and read in succession, they present a much larger picture. That's what makes Dubliners both a series of short stories and also a novel, in that it tells one large story when you read them all together. Okay, so the main theme of this book is paralysis, and that is when characters are stuck either physically, emotionally, or spiritually. Sometimes they are stuck due to illness, but other times they're stuck for reasons involving politics, religion, or culture. Now, paralysis or stagnation is a characteristic condition of modern man, which affects many of us and may have many different sources. You might be frustrated in an unfulfilling job. Maybe later you'll be in an unhappy marriage or in an unsatisfying friendship. Life is a series of situations that oftentimes you will find yourself constrained by. The protagonists of these stories have some desire that they would like to fulfill, and they attempt to do so, but are forced to give up and accept their limitations. Joyce rails against that impulse to accept defeat. Okay, now paralysis is often, as a sickness, comes before death. And of course, death comes before decay or rot. Things that don't move begin to erode quickly. Again, this idea is applied not only just to individuals, but also to Ireland in general. Joyce wants Ireland to become more innovative, more advanced, to move along with the rest of Europe and leave the old ways behind. If we do not find a way to escape that decay, we are doomed to failure. Dubliners begins and ends with death. The first story begins with the death of a priest, and the novel ends with a story called The Dead. Okay, so there's a circular structure to the novel. Circles are all throughout the novel as a motif. And the idea is to break free from that circle. Now, especially in The Dead, we all witness a number of characters that are alive. They live and breathe, but they are in some ways dead inside. So if you watch the movie Waking Ned Divine, Ned is the missing piece in that movie. In the novel Dubliners, Michael Fury is the missing character. He's physically dead, but he lived a life, as his name Fury suggests. He lived a life of passion. He lived a life of love. And so he is technically the most living character that we meet in the book, the unsaid character, the character that is not present, affects pervasively everything else in the book. So an epiphany, as you remember from Araby, is a sudden realization of truth. This does go back to the Christian tradition of the Feast of the Epiphany, which celebrates the revelation of Christ's divinity to the Magi. That's why the Feast of the Epiphany happens at Christmas time. And James Joyce's short story, The Dead, which ends the novel, takes place at a Christmas party on the Feast of the Epiphany. Now you're looking in this each story for a moment where something is physically or spiritually awakened in a character. They come to some new awareness about themselves or the world around them. Doesn't necessarily need to be divine truth. It can just be a truth that suddenly comes to them through thoughts or actions. Okay, so the style of this novel is realism. I want to remind you that this is the Dublin of Joyce's imagination. So just as if you were reading Tolkien's The Hobbit, Middle Earth is a completely fictional reality out of Tolkien's imagination. This Dublin, while it is realistic in depiction, and it is based on things that Joyce observed from his own daily life, it is still a fictional world. It is still the Dublin of Joyce's imagination. The symbolism is deeply connected to Irish culture and Irish daily life. Characters are described through introspection rather than description. The realism presented in the novel was the reason at first Joyce encountered a lot of resistance and censorship from his publishers. The publishers felt that unflattering representations of the crown, the king, the Irish themselves, the way that the Irish speak, their obscure colloquialisms, that people would either be offended by this book or they wouldn't understand it if they were from anywhere other than Dubliners or Dublin. And so that made publishers nervous. Later in Joyce's work, when his novels became much more difficult and more experimental, he was censored for what many assumed was something lurid or offensive in the stream of consciousness. But that probably said more about the censors than the material being censored. They kind of saw what they wanted to see in those experimental works. This novel, though, is very easy to read, but you can imagine that some people, politicians, public figures, might easily have seen themselves in the unflattering depictions and gotten offended. Okay. There is subjective perception of time. The novel doesn't flow chronologically. Stories sometimes manipulate time with flashbacks. And there is, of course, subjective points of view. We start off with first-person narration with the children and then move into other kinds of narration. Again, all of that calls into question what might be a singular truth, a singular point of view. Truth, it turns out, is in the eye of the beholder. Each story gives us that message. Okay. In medias res is when a story begins in the middle of. The Sisters, the fourth story that we cover, will begin in the middle of action. You won't know who is speaking or who that person is speaking about. Okay, but you're meant to piece things together as you go along. It's a little bit like a dill pickle, where you have a story that happens in the middle of the action, and it's up to the reader to figure things out and piece them together as you go. Okay, so finally, what Joyce saw as the artist's purpose was to not tell people what to believe, but persuade them to perceive of reality differently, to look at things anew. For this reason, Joyce thought a work of art should be impersonal. Joyce wanted to stand outside of Dublin and present the story and the people in this novel from afar. And that could be one reason that he left Ireland and became an exile. It was a way of distancing himself from the subject matter so that he could present it in a more objective or a clear way, perhaps by giving himself that distance. Okay, so the novel begins with the short story, The Sisters. Okay, and this is a story that is very simple to read. It's very, very short, and it's written in very easy language. However, I would encourage you to read very carefully, in that, like Araby, it's often what is not said that is the most important, and it is often what you have to read behind the lines or behind the story. So read deeply, look for what's inferred by what's there instead of what's literally told to you.